Hello everyone and welcome back to my Warhammer 40k guides. I am Brady and today I would like to remake my old video, how to build a competitive army in Warhammer 40k. I recently decided to get back to my roots and to start making faction focus videos where I cover each individual faction and what they can bring to the table, pun intended. But as I was starting on my first faction focus, I noticed I was using a lot of terms that aren't covered in my older videos. So because of this, I felt it was time for an update on this video to cover those terms. Also, after rewatching my older videos, I noticed there was some useful information that I didn't include and I am now going to include in this video. Also, some of the information from the last video has changed because the game has changed drastically over the past year, so the video definitely needed an update. So with all of that said, let's not waste any more time and let's jump into how to build a competitive army in Warhammer 40k. There are a few steps to go over, so let's go over each one at a time. Step 1. Pick a faction or factions to play. This is pretty self-explanatory, but if you want to make an army, you're going to have to pick a faction or two to make that army out of. You can do this based on personal preference of playstyle or based off of whatever faction seems to be the strongest at the time. Some people look down on others for playing an army only because it is strong in the game, but I see nothing wrong with this. A player is allowed to use the tools given to them in order to create a strong list. After all, this video is about how to build a competitive list for tournaments and not necessarily how to build a fluffy list for a narrative event. So with that in mind, if you have multiple armies, I would always choose to play the faction that seems to be the strongest at the time, at least when trying to compete at an event. Because no matter how balanced Warhammer 40k is, there will always be a few armies that stand out above the rest, even if it's only by a small margin. In competitive, we take every advantage we can get, and choosing a proper army is the beginning of that. With that said, you can still pick any faction you like to try and compete with, but just know that if you pick a low tier army, you're going to have a harder time beating the high tier armies unless you are a much better general than your opponent. If you want to know where your army stands on the tier list, I have a video for that, which I will link in the description. For clarity, the tier list video is based mostly off of my opinion, so take that as you will. Step 2. Pick a type of list you want to play. So now that you have picked a faction or factions to play in your list, you need to figure out what playstyle you'd like to go for. There are a few different playstyles and lists that work, and here are what they are. You have Horde Armies, Elite Armies, Gunline Armies, Alpha Strike Armies, Beta Strike Armies, Melee Rush Armies, and Deathball Armies. So let's go over what each of these types of lists consist of and what they aim to accomplish. Keep in mind, some of these lists might overlap and you might end up making a combination list like an Elite Gunline or a Horde Gunline or an Alpha Strike Gunline, which I will go over soon when the examples arise. So let's start with Horde Armies. Horde armies are exactly what they sound like. They are a horde of cheap infantry or small models and usually consist of armies that have 100 plus models. Good examples of armies that can pull off a horde list would be Orcs, Imperial Guard, or Astra Militarum, and Tyranids. Horde armies are the best armies in the game for board control because of a tremendous amount of bodies that they can put out. So they can fill the board to a point that the opponent can't really move out and grab objectives. If you aren't aware of what board control is, I have a video I've done in the past that I will also link in the description. Also, because hordes come with so many bodies, sometimes the opponent's list doesn't have enough firepower to deal with them. For example, if you brought 300 models in your army, but your opponent can only put out 60 shots a turn, and then they still have to roll to hit and wound, you most likely aren't going to get tabled. So because of this, Horde armies seem to counter Elite armies pretty well, because they can outboard control them, and because Elite armies normally don't come with enough firepower to eliminate 200 plus models, while also taking casualties themselves. With that said, Horde armies aren't very durable when it comes to individual models, so they rely on the tremendous amount of bodies that they have as their durability. Sure, your Orc boys only have a 6-up save, so they will die to almost anything that successfully wounds them, but because you have 100 other Orc boys to replace that one, that's where the staying power or the durability of your army comes from. They also come with a ton of attacks or shots depending on the type of horde you choose to play. So if you enjoy rolling a bucket of dice, then this is the type of list you will most likely enjoy the most. Elite Armies. Elite armies are the opposite of Horde armies, and they bring the most elite and expensive units to a list. Examples of this would be Imperial Knights, Imperial Custodes, and Grey Knights. Elite armies are normally very resilient and can hold their own, because the units used in elite armies normally come with multiple wounds per model and almost always have great saves. For example, regular Custodian infantry come with 3 wounds each at toughness 5 with a 2+ armor save and a 4+ invulnerable save. This means that the amount of shots that could kill 30 Orc boys might not even be able to kill 3 Custodian guard models. So if you prefer resiliency over numbers, then elite armies are the way to go. However, they do suffer from one thing. which is normally a lack of board control. This is why I feel that Horde Armies counter Elite Armies pretty well. Sure, the Elite Army might get close to tabling a Horde Army with minimal casualties, but because of the board control the Hordes have from the early game, sometimes the Horde Armies can score enough points to make it impossible for the Elite Army to catch up. Gunline Armies. It's pretty self-explanatory, but a Gunline Army is an army that uses tons of ranged weaponry to blast the opponent from across the table. Examples of armies that can do this well are Astra Militarum, Ultramarines, and AdMech. Sometimes this type of army tends to be another type as well. For example, if you play Astra Militarum, then you're probably making a Horde Gunline. Or if you play Ultramarines, then you're probably making an Elite Gunline. Or if you play something like Dark Eldar, then you can make an Alpha Strike Gunline. Gunline armies usually use cover to get better saves while bombarding the enemy with tons of shots, and usually are immobile. This gives your army a bit of protection and normally counters elite armies since they have the shots to kill them safely from across the table. The one downside to gunline armies is that they normally don't have great board control, kind of like elite armies, since most gunlines want to stand still and shoot. And with more and more TOs making better setup tables at events with good line of sight blocking terrain, it's harder and harder for traditional gun lines to win games. They can still win games, but I personally think that traditional gun lines are probably the weakest type of army to play, at least right now. Alpha Strike Armies. Alpha Strike Armies are armies that want to demolish the opponent on turn 1 in order to cripple them to a point that it makes it very hard for the opponent to win. With the changes from the big FAQ a few months ago, they changed the way Deep Strike works. Most Alpha Strike armies were gutted, because a great tactic for Alpha Strike armies was to hide a lot of their army in Deep Strike so it wouldn't be touched if their opponent got first turn, but now because you can only Deep Strike outside of your deployment zone on turn 2 or 3, and because of you have to have equal power level on the board and in Deep Strike, it lowered the effectiveness of the Deep Striking Alpha Strike armies, which was the main way to play Alpha Strike armies. The only armies I can think of that can still perform a good Alpha Strike would be any of the Eldari races like Craftworlds, Drukhari, or Harlequins, and this is because those armies don't need Deep Strike in order to get across the board on turn 1. These armies are the fastest in the game and can easily get into a good range right at the beginning of the game. But again, with TOs getting smarter about Alpha Strikes, they're setting up better line of sight blocking terrain to stop these Alpha Strikes, and for good reason too. Alpha Strike armies are probably the least fun to play against because losing a quarter to half of your army on turn 1 usually makes people want to quit the game. So I'm glad Games Workshop and tournament organizers combined have been doing what they can to stop Alpha Strike armies. Like I mentioned before about some armies consisting of multiple types of lists, some gun lines end up having the same effect as Alpha Strike armies if they happen to go first. But this only happens when you're playing on a board with little to no line of sight blocking terrain, and or if your opponent has a suboptimal deployment and left too many valuable units in vulnerable positions. Beta Strike Armies. This type of army is almost the same as Alpha Strike, except these armies do their strike on turn 2 or 3, meaning the opponent has a bit more time to spread out their units for a better defense. This is a healthier type of playstyle when compared to the old Alpha Strike armies, because like I just said, it gives the opponent a turn to set up their defenses better and to try to gain a bit of board control. Armies that can perform beta strikes really well would be armies that utilize the Deep Strike mechanic, which would be Blood Angels, Grey Knights, and Custodians. These armies usually want to whittle down the enemy screen on turn 1 to open way for some juicy charge targets that were hidden behind the screen. And if you don't know what a screen is, don't worry, I will be getting to that in a minute after I explain the types of armies. Some benefits to this army is that they are great from turn 2 and 3 on, but usually lack a good board presence on turn 1 that can come back to bite them if their opponent capitalized on it very well. Melee Rush Armies. Melee rush armies are exactly what they sound like, a bunch of melee units rushing the enemy. Depending on how you make the list, it can be amazing or complete crap. This is one of the hardest lists to pilot properly because it requires a great knowledge of the charge and fight phase and how to abuse pile-ins and consolidations and heroic interventions. You also have to understand how to keep your units alive by surrounding an enemy model, which is actually a lot harder than it sounds. Armies that can pull off this type of list are Demons, Chaos Space Marines, and Space Wolves. The idea is that you advance everything on turn 1 to be up in your enemy's face, and because of this, you effectively overload your opponent with so many threats, and sometimes they can't deal with all of them, meaning a bunch of your army is going to be getting charges off on turn 2 or 3, depending on the deployment type. This type of army also has some bad matchups and easy weaknesses. For example, if your opponent brings a very good and large screen and they know how to set up their screen properly, then you're going to have a bad time and end up only killing the chaff while your opponent annihilates your main forces. Also, if you get a long deployment like Hammer and Anvil, you could possibly get shot off the table before you get to do any damage. Because of this, I personally don't like melee rush armies, but I have seen them do well, so I decided to add them to the list. And finally, Deathball Armies. Deathball Armies are armies that treat their whole army as one giant unit, mainly because they benefit greatly from auras or spells, or because they want to protect a bunch of characters with the character rule. Examples of Deathball Armies would be Thousand Suns character smite spam, or Blood Angel Slamguinius lists, or Space Wolf Smashlord lists, or Tau Gunlines. The first three examples I mentioned are basically giant balls of infantry or units that protect characters as they move up the board. They also try to thin out the enemy screen with shooting to make way for juicy charge targets for the characters, and for Thousand Suns, it's basically the same thing, except just allowing your characters to smite better targets. For Tau, it's because they make great use of the rule for the greater good, which is basically fire support in Overwatch, and the army really needs this to not lose in the charge phase against some armies, and it makes them a pretty good counter to most melee armies in the game. So that covers all the different types of lists you can build in order to have a good chance when competing at events. All of these lists have different playstyles that can cater to the way you want to play, and all of these playstyles have proven that they can win games and even whole events. Now before I get into the types of units you should include in your list, let's talk about something I didn't mention in the original video, and that is step 3. Find units with good synergy. You want your army to have a goal and a purpose, and you want your list to make sense. If you bring a bunch of units that don't have synergy or break synergy with the rest of your list, then the list isn't going to be optimal. For example, let's say you are playing Raven Guard, whose army-wide rule is -1 to hit your infantry, dreadnoughts, and bikes. Now let's say you brought a bunch of dreadnoughts but also brought some predators. The predators don't get the -1 and will be clear targets for your opponents to annihilate. So instead, you should bring more units that get the -1 so that your opponent doesn't have any clear targets to shoot at. You should also build a list around an idea that seems good. For example, is the list that I used to place second at an ITC major. I included a couple of Craftworld Psychers into my mainly Drukhari list because the spells I took greatly helped the Drukhari stuff. These spells were Doom and Jinx. Doom is a spell that targets an enemy model and allows you to reroll all failed wounds against it. And Jinx is another spell that targets an enemy unit and minuses 1 from its saves, which includes invulnerable saves. These spells helped my Drukhari Gunline annihilate one big target a turn like a Knight or a Baneblade, or helped me annihilate a giant horde blob like Gene Stealers or Orc Boys. Another quick example is bringing a gunline whose purpose is to kill the enemy screen on turn 1 or 2 to make way for deep striking units on turn 2 or 3. These are things you should consider when making a list. Synergy is a big part of a good list, so make sure that everything in your list has a purpose and can work off of each other efficiently. Now with that said, let's get into step 4, finding units to fill roles in your army. There are many different roles or purposes of units, and I will discuss all of them now. Screening units. In most of these lists, except for maybe pure elite lists or melee rush lists, you're going to want screening units. A screening unit is basically a nice way of saying a meat shield. With the way melee works in 40k, you're going to want to provide protection from charges against your more valuable units. This is especially important in gunline lists because if someone gets in combat with your shooting units, then they are basically dead because they won't be shooting for the rest of the game. So to screen properly, you line up cheap infantry and cheap models in front of your more valuable units to stop them from being charged. Screening units are also great for board control since they usually come with a lot of bodies, and they also help a lot with deep strike denial, which I talk about in another video that I will link in the description. Screening units are also great for holding objectives because they are so cheap that if your opponent wants to push you off the objective, they have to waste firepower on the chaff instead of a valuable unit that is actually going to do some damage. Some armies can get away without having good screens because the units themselves can avoid being charged because of mobility, or they can just endure the charge and hit back pretty hard, which is why I said melee rush lists and elite armies don't necessarily need a screen. So test your army out and see if it needs a screen. If it does, then add one. If you need more of a screen, then add more. If you don't need a screen because you can avoid combat with mobility or can endure the charges, then go for no screen and instead opt for more powerhouse units. Anti-Infantry. Pretty self-explanatory, but anti-infantry units are units that bring weapons that are good at killing infantry. This means high volume of shots to get through many bodies with a strength of 4 to 8, 0 to -3 AP. It normally does 1 damage or 2 damage for each shot. The weapons that do 2 damage a shot are anti-heavy infantry, while the weapons that do 1 damage a shot are just regular anti-infantry. Examples of weapons that are decent anti-infantry would be assault cannons for Space Marines, splinter cannons for the Drukhari, chain swords or chain axes for Chaos Space Marines, or even the humble bolt gun. Stuff like las guns and Astra Militarum can also work as anti-infantry, but because of their low strength of 3, I think they are better suited to be called chip damage, since they aren't very reliable at killing anything other than other toughness 3 infantry. Anti-tank. Anti-tank are weapons that can deal good damage to vehicles and monsters. These are weapons that have strength 8 or higher, and usually have a -2 or better AP, and usually do D3 or D6 damage. Vehicles and monsters have a lot of wounds when compared to infantry, so using multiple damage weapons helps kill them quicker. Sure, it's less shots overall, but the impact of those shots are much greater. They also require a good AP because most vehicles and monsters in the game come with a 3-up save, so you're going to want to lower that to make your chances of wounds getting through even more efficient. Psychic. Not every army has access to psychic spells, but the ones that do should almost always include some sort of psyker or a unit that can provide some sort of psychic defense. Access to doing mortal wounds with smite can come in clutch against units that have a good invulnerable save like Thunderwolf Cavalry with storm shields, or even regular characters. Also, being able to deny enemy spells can come in clutch, since some spells in the game are insanely strong. For example, spells like Death Hex or Null Zone that cancel enemy invulnerable saves. So having a chance of denying these spells will help increase your chances of winning games. Support. Almost every list is going to want support units. Support units are usually characters that give some sort of buff. For example, Guilliman is a support character alongside being a beatstick because he allows Ultramarine models to reroll all failed hits and wounds within 6 inches of him. He also allows Imperium units within 12 inches to reroll once to hit, and he also gives +1 to advance and charge rolls for Imperium units within 12 inches. All of this combined makes him a great pick for a support choice for Ultramarines or almost any Imperium army. You can also have support from psychic spells. For example, in Space Wolves there's a spell called Stormcaller that makes friendly Space Wolf units within 6 inches gain the benefit of cover. Any unit that buffs up your other units would be a support unit, and every list could use a support unit or two. With that said, don't overdo it on support units, because if you do, you will lack the firepower needed to actually win the game. I normally don't bring a support unit unless it's going to be supporting 3 times its points cost, unless that unit has another purpose, which is something I will discuss after the unit types. But overall, support units are good, but only if they're supporting enough units to actually make them worth it. So that's all the types of units to bring in your list. As for how much of each you should bring, that is entirely dependent on your current meta of where you will be playing. If you are only playing locally, then you're going to want to scope out the other players in your club and see what they play, and then try to counter those armies with your list. For example, if your local meta is dominated by knights, then go really heavy on anti-tank, since that's what you're going to need to take them down. If there are a ton of Horde armies, then you're going to want to go heavy on anti-infantry. If there is a good balance of army types, then you're going to want to figure out a good balance for your list. If you have trouble doing this because maybe you're new to the game, or maybe you just have a hard time knowing what is efficient and what isn't, I offer basic coaching and even a list critiquing service where I will go over your list and let you know what I think of it and how competitive it will actually be. So if you wanted, you could build a list with the advice I give in this video and get it checked out by me to ensure you're on the right path. Or if you're lazy and don't want to put in the time and effort it requires to build a good competitive list, I can just build one for you as well. But if you've made it this far into the video, I'm assuming you at least want to learn how to build a list yourself, so I could just give you the basic coaching and critique your list for you to let you know if you're on the right path or not. These services are all included in one package that also gets you access to the Almost Pro Gaming Discord channel, where you can talk with either myself or other patrons about Warhammer 40k. So if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, then check me out on Patreon. I will have a link in the description. And that about covers it for the steps needed in order to make a competitive list. There are a few tips I have left though, so let's get those out of the way real quick before I end this video. So when I was talking about support units and how you shouldn't bring too many unless they have another purpose, let's discuss that in each unit's purpose. Kind of like your army in general and how I stated it should have an overall goal or purpose, each individual unit has a purpose as well and sometimes can have multiple purposes, but make sure those multiple purposes make sense. For example, a support character like Guilliman is also a great beatstick. So he has 2 purposes, support and beatstick. And I don't think I mentioned it, but a beatstick is exactly what it sounds like. It's a stick you beat people with. So to get the best bang for your buck when using Guilliman, I would use him in a mobile gunline or a Deathball that moves up the board. So eventually, you can make use of his second purpose as a beat stick. You can still use him as a reroll bot in a traditional gunline, but I would recommend having him support 3 times his point cost like I mentioned earlier, meaning you'd need him buffing 1200 points worth of Marines to make him efficient, at least in my opinion. And that's basically your entire army. Another example of a unit with multiple purposes would be a Smash Captain. He gives rerolls to his army while moving up the board, but then becomes a beat stick when needed. Keep in mind though, some combinations don't really work too well, and I've seen a lot of people make this mistake. I've seen people use a character like a captain whose main purpose is to give rerolls to a stationary gunline, but then they also give that character a Power Fist and a Combi Melta, when in reality the Fist and the Melta are wasted points because he's never going to be used as anti-tank if your gunline is doing their job properly. And if they aren't doing their job properly, it might be because you've wasted points on upgrades that weren't needed. And if you end up using the Power Fist and the Melta, it's because your gunline is probably in shambles and you're now losing the game. So make sure when upgrading your support characters, or even units in general, that their purpose makes sense and synergizes well with what your army is going to be doing and trying to accomplish. Stratagems. Always consider stratagems when picking units for your list. Some stratagems are insanely strong and will dictate your overall strategy for certain armies. For example, Blood Angels have amazing deep strike stratagems, so if you're playing Blood Angels without deep striking, then you're doing something wrong. Or Dark Eldar with Agents of Vect. That stratagem is so good, you'd be dumb to not include it in your list, even if it's just a small patrol detachment of Blackheart in order to unlock it. Stratagems are a huge part of 8th edition and should always be considered when coming up with an overall strategy for your army. The next tip would be to try to use units that are points efficient. I will make a separate video talking about this, but for now I'll just say to use the units that do the required job the best for the cheapest amount of points. For example, you can have a squad of Devastators with 4 Last Cannons, who can put out around 10 damage a turn if they have the rerolls. This unit costs around 200 points. Or you can take a Smash Captain for 130 points, who will put out 9 damage on average, and also gets protected because of the character keyword. It gets a lot more in-depth than this, which is why I will make another video for it, but overall this is the idea. If you have a unit that does another unit's job as efficiently for a cheaper price, then always take the cheaper unit. And then the last tip I would like to give is that spam is okay. Like I mentioned before about some players hating on people who try to power game and play the strongest armies or unit, some people will also get mad at spam. But spam is good, at least when it comes to competitive. If one unit you have access to is a clear cut above the rest, then use that unit as much as possible. With the rule of 3 that was released, you're only allowed 3 of each data sheet, meaning 3 of each unit, unless it's a troop or a dedicated transport, in which case you can spam those units all you like because they are exempt from the rule of 3. But I mean, if you notice your Demon Prince usually makes his points back every game, then why not use 3 Demon Princes for maximum efficiency? Redundancy is great in 40k, because if you spam a unit that provides the best of anything, then you're going to do really well in that field. For example, if you're spamming a unit that gives you the best anti-infantry your army has to offer, then you're going to annihilate some infantry even if a few units whiff their shots, because you have the redundancy of more units to bring in more shots. It also helps because if you lose a unit of something like Devastator Marines, then you have 2 other units of Devastators to cover up that hole. It's the idea of having a replacement for a unit that will inevitably die. After all, Warhammer is a game based off of math, whether you like it or not. So try not to think of a unit as Devastators or Demon Princes, and instead think of them as numbers that they output. Names mean nothing. Fluff means nothing. It's only the numbers that matter when it comes to competitive 40k. So spam the units that seem to be the best and follow the steps in this video and you should end up with a good list. Some armies can get away without spam and still have a competitive list capable of winning events, but those lists still follow a similar formula to list building that I provided in this video, and they still meet all the requirements for a good list. As long as you can meet all the requirements and steps from this video with or without spam, then you should have a decent list. And with that said, that should cover everything for this video. If I happen to forget anything or if I misworded myself, I will correct it with a pinned comment in the comment section. Also, don't forget to check out the channel's sponsor, themagnetbaron.com. They offer magnets of all sizes, magnetized movement trays, magnetized flight stands, and even offer fully built magnetized models, all for a great price. So if you're looking for magnets for your hobbying needs, then check out themagnetbaron.com. Anyways, that's going to be it for this video. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for more Warhammer 40k content if you enjoyed this video. And if you would like to purchase my list building service, you can do so on Patreon. Or if you would just like to help support the channel to allow me to continue making videos full time, you can also do that on Patreon. I will have a link for the Patreon page in the description. Anyways, thanks for watching the video. I hope I was able to help you learn some stuff about list building, and I will see you in the next video. Happy wargaming.